And this is the big mistake all the political elites make. They think that by having Hitler inside the tent, he can be controlled, when of course we know he can't. Everybody is exhibiting imperial tendencies, except for those empires that have collapsed.
Historically, both Germany and the USSR know that at some point, one side or the other is coming to dominate Europe. It's just a question of who's going to do it first.
Britain, France, maybe Germany and Japan, containing a Soviet Union that's suddenly found itself out of control.
This is a very bitty war because the US is notionally on their side, but not really. Japan and Britain have very different strategic aims. It's just at this point they both hate the USSR.
You're not getting the Holocaust.
No.
There was no plan at all in these other right-wing parties to eliminate the Jewish race.
Which is the difference between the sort of more far-right ideology and the Nazi.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I think World War II shifts from basically being, as we see it now, democracy versus fascism, essentially. It probably becomes a capitalism versus communism
Exactly that.
war.
The Second World War is the defining event of the 20th century. It changed borders, economies, empires, and ushered in the next 80 years of history. It was fought on many fronts among competing ideologies, but at its core, the Allied victory represented a defeat of Nazi Germany and fascism. Yet there were other reasons for going to war. Virtually no political leaders in Germany were content with their new borders drawn up after the Treaty of Versailles. The Japanese had already begun industrializing and expanding. The Soviet Union was building the largest military on earth, and both Britain and France were nervously keeping an eye on the state of their empires. So today we ask, what if the Nazis had never risen to power? What happens then to the Second World War and beyond? I'm Fergus Macphee, and welcome to History Undone, the show where we look at how the briefest of moments can shape our world. Every episode, we focus on a different military campaign or a tide of history, and with the help of our experts, we ask whether those split-second decisions could have changed the outcome and history itself. Today, it's the rise of Nazi Germany and its monumental impact on modern history. Yet without it, might there still have been a Second World War of sorts, and how would the world look today? These are, of course, questions for our experts, and joining me as ever are the historian and author Rear Admiral Dr. Chris Parry. And returning to the channel once again, I'm delighted to welcome back the YouTuber and naval historian Drakinefeld. Welcome to you both. Okay, we have in front of us today a map of Europe after the Treaty of Versailles. So this just shows the new borders that have been drawn up post First World War. And I think this seems like a good place to start, Chris, because I mentioned in my intro there, these new borders, even if you take Adolf Hitler and the Nazis out of the equation, not many in Germany are happy with the state of affairs.
Well, I think what we have to reflect on is you're seeing the breakup of quite a lot of empires here. The German Empire's broken up, the Russian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, all broken up. So they've fragmented around their edges. And nobody's happy with the borders. They've sort of settled them. We've also got a huge economic crisis associated with the disruption of trade. Hasn't recovered. It doesn't really recover until 1926 in Germany. And as you said in the introduction, the major victorious powers, Britain and France, are looking to their empires. And certainly through the 20s, you see real reinforcement in ideological and indeed practical terms of what survives. And indeed, the British Empire at 1923 reaches its greatest extent. People forget about this after the First World War. And so all this is in ferment. And you've got a lot of political parties growing up. You've had obviously communism erupt onto the scene as a result of the Russian Revolution. You see the rise of fascism, the strong man needed in various places. And so you've got a lot of people crossing borders, a lot of people think they're in the wrong country, they're under the wrong jurisdiction. And most of the political parties that exist in these countries are actually leveraging that dissatisfaction and basically making statements. And you see with Mein Kampf, when Hitler writes it in the 1920s, all that sort of angst that leaches out. Now, the biggest problem right at the heart of Europe is you've got a new country called Poland.
Indeed.
And apart from the Poles, very few people are happy with that, to tell you the truth. And Germany in particular has been divested of quite a lot of its territory. Even the Russians have, because in those days, Poland actually extended to Ukraine and what is now Belarus. And so all that's going on. You've got this on the southern side. In Austro-Hungary, for example, they're hankering after being imperial again. And a lot of people, like Hitler himself, are saying, well, we're Germans, aren't we, really?
Yeah.
And so can we be part of that? So everything's in ferment. The Treaty of Versailles has just settled everything down, but it's simmering away quite happily on all four burners.
Yeah. And Chris talks, Drac, welcome back to History Undone, first of all. Chris talks about the many parties that you see in Germany at the moment. I think you, before we went on air, you spoke about that too.
Yeah.
Just talk us through some of who they are and maybe some of the personalities involved.
Right, so there's loads of political parties. I mean, it's a little bit unfamiliar for perhaps viewers in the US or the UK, where we're used to two-party systems, maybe three-party systems. In Germany at this point, you've got obviously the Nazis, or NSDAP at the time. You've got the KDP and the SDP, who are varying flavours of left-wing. It's got left-wing to ultra-left-wing. And those three are the ones that are picking up most of the votes as far as political parties go. But of course, you've got also a separate vote back then for president. So you've got president and a chancellor. And below them, you've got numerous parties. So you've got some parties who, if people are familiar with German politics today, they might recognise as the forebearers of them. But you've also got an awful lot of one-note parties. So there's a party specifically for World War I veterans, there's a party for the German middle class, there's a party for German farmers, there's a party for German industrial workers. There's lots and lots of little one-note parties, but of course, because they can focus very strongly on their single note, they pick up a lot of people from that demographic. So when you look at the 1932 election, below the headline figures where there's multiple millions of people voting for NASDAQ, KDP, SDP, there's over a dozen parties that are picking up hundreds of thousands, maybe a million or two votes. And that's actually what's causing the deadlock, because none of the big parties can actually get the majority they need to take power.
And crucially, in our counterfactual export today, Adolf Hitler would also still be there as well. But is it fair to say, Chris, most likely, obviously I'm jumping slightly ahead here, the other person to take over would probably most likely be von Schleicher?
There's a whole host of people at the end of the 1920s and 30s. Von Schleicher is certainly a major rival, and of course Hitler very quickly eliminates him in the Night of the Long Knives once he gets into power. He's certainly pushing. He's got a very strong military background. He's a general. He's got a good reputation from the First World War. He's been very strong in politics. He's very devious. I mean, this guy is a very good political operator. But he thinks by bringing Hitler into the system, he can tame him. And this is the big mistake all the political elites make. They think that by having Hitler inside the tent, he can be controlled, when, of course, we know he can't. The other thing worth mentioning, of course, you've got a very elderly, respected president, in fact, effectively, in the form of Hindenburg, this World War I general. He's standing in the way very much of some of the extreme elements, particularly on the right. And as Drac well knows, the left elements, the SDP and the KDP, are actually relying on...
The KDP, they're the communists.
They are definitely communists. And let's bear in mind, they got 17% of the vote in 1932 that brought Hitler to the foreground. So they're quite powerful. And at one stage, they had over 55,000 active members. So the SDP and the KDP are looking to Hindenburg to actually keep the lid on quite a lot of this. What's really important, though, is the Nazi Party have the SA and, of course, the SS, huge militarised heirs of the Freikorps. And indeed, the other big right-wing party, the German National People's Party, has over 500,000 Stahlhelm. These are the steel helmets. These are the veterans from World War I. So these are easily mobilisable paramilitaries and people who can disrupt quite a lot of this. Put on top of that, you've got separatist movements, the Bavarians, for example, say, well, maybe we won't be part of this.
So politically, like von Schleicher, if we just stay on him for a second, politically he's right, but wouldn't be classed as far right?
Oh, yeah, he would be.
He still would be.
Yeah. I mean, there's another element as well that comes in. There's quite a lot of people want to bring back the Kaiser. They actually want another monarchy again, saying, actually, it was great before the First World War, let's do that again. But these right-wing parties are anti-communist, predominantly. They're anti-Jewish as well as anything else. The only difference between the German National People's Party and the Nazis is this stress on Lebensraum and on basically really extreme measures for the Jews.
Yeah, which will become key, obviously, during the Second World War and the timeline that we know. And as Chris said, that's key for this whole sort of new area of Europe.
Yeah, and I mean, if we want to sort of look at how this could happen, you've got to remember that you've got two elections in very close succession. You've got the 1932 election. That's when the Nazis get the most votes. It's still not a majority, but they're by far and away the largest party. What doesn't help on the overall political scene is that when Hindenburg first came into power in the 20s, he was mostly riding on a wave of right-wing support. However, a lot of right-wingers became disillusioned with him, and they've mostly gone off to vote for Hitler and various other right-wing groups. And so when Hindenburg comes back in, he's actually coming in mostly on a left-wing support base. And then, of course, he's faced with, okay, I've got a left-wing support base, but a mostly right-wing minority but largest party. And if he has to make some kind of compromise with them somehow, and that's going to disillusion his voter base, and he hasn't got that much long left to live either. But then we have the 1933 election. They lose quite a bit of the vote share compared to what they got in 32, and the KDP and SDP pick up some of that vote share. So if the KDP and SDP had put aside their differences and gone, OK, we're going to form a generic left-wing bloc, historically they don't quite have the numbers to then combined outnumber the Nazis, but almost. So it would only take a very small change in that 1933 election, plus the two putting their issues aside, that then they would be in a position where essentially the decision that Hindenburg has made, as Chris outlined, of, OK, these are the largest minorities, let's bring them in. Now the KDP and SDP are the largest minority, but with the slight disadvantage of individually they're not, and the right wing has the SA, the SS, and the Stahlhelms.
We're going to zoom out in just a second to focus on more global and what the global powers want in this situation. Just picking up off that, in this situation, without perhaps that militarisation that, of course, you see from the Nazi Party, as you said, the SS, the failures of the League of Nations, obviously, that we see in the actual timeline, does that resonate as well if any of these other powers in Germany are in office?
The problem with the League of Nations is that when it was set up, the United States didn't become part of it. They were the sort of guarantor. And every time somebody misbehaves, whether it's Italy or Japan or Germany eventually, they leave. It's got no structural basis for enforcing its decisions. Everything has to be unanimous, and they have no military power whatsoever. So the League of Nations fails utterly to actually contain it. And many of the faults of the League of Nations were actually tied into how they formed the United Nations at the end of the Second World War. But it's a complete non-starter.
So military action on Poland is very likely.
Well, somebody, whether it's the Russians, the Soviets, or the Germans that want to resolve it, or both of them, nobody likes Poland being there. And for their own reasons, whether for the Soviets it's dominating the Baltic, or the Germans saying, look, there's a whole load of land here. And you've got to remember, quite a lot of Germans in their surnames have the names of estates that are now in Poland. So the Vons are, and the Zums and everything else, and they've lost all their estates. And this Polish corridor, of course, to give Poland a route to the sea, is a real point of contention. And throughout the literature of the 1920s and 30s, you see the Weimar Republic saying, it's no big deal for us. But everybody else saying it is a big deal for us. And it's part of Hitler's attraction, of course, because he's saying, I'm going to get it back. And if you're the Poles right now, you're reaching out to say, look, we're trying to hold these two titans apart, and we're trying to balance the two, and we're also looking for allies as well. Having said that, the Poles were actually quite belligerent.
Yeah, they say, well, you see it in our timeline,
Yeah, they're actually quite belligerent and say, don't come here, you'll suffer. So in some ways, they big themselves up, and unfortunately, in 1939, they get their bluff called.
Well, it is, of course, a world war, so let's just leave Europe for a second, zoom out and take a more global look at what each of the big powers wanted in the run-up to the Second World War. Welcome back. Now we have a new map in front of us of the whole of the world. This is taken from the middle of the 1930s. And we just want to run you through what some of the great powers at the time are thinking and what they are wanting, which may have also led to a Second World War. Now, Drac, I just want to start with you and talk about Japan and Abyssinia as well. Because actually, obviously, that happens in our actual timeline in the 1930s.
Yes.
So we're already sort of seeing some of those desires.
Yeah, so the Abyssinia crisis takes place obviously in Northeast Africa. The Italians have decided they want their new Roman Empire, so they head off to invade what was today essentially Ethiopia, which goes catastrophically badly for them. Everyone's expecting it to be a one shot all
Crisis
done.
is in the name. It's not a great sign.
So everyone's looking at going, freshly mechanized, air power, poison gas against essentially a bunch of tribesmen with horses and camels and rifles, and somehow they grind to a screaming halt. It almost triggers a war with Britain. The Mediterranean fleet gets massively reinforced. There's a whole bunch of photos from this period showing multiple carriers and battleships waiting in Alexandria. And it gets right down to the wire when the sailors in the Royal Navy, they know the Italian troop convoy is coming because they have to come through the Suez Canal, and they're expecting the order to sail and destroy at any moment. And it's a right on a knife edge whether there's going to be an Italo-Anglo war over the Abyssinian crisis. Obviously, that doesn't quite happen. But it knocks another pedestal out of the League of Nations because the League says, well, knock it off, and the Italians go, make us. It turns out you actually can't. Yeah. So that has caused not only immediate issues, but also in the larger strategic term, Britain has spent the 20s and the early 30s preparing to fight a war in the Pacific because they think they're going to be fighting Japan. And historically, the Abyssinia crisis followed by and the rise of fascism in Germany makes Britain reconsider its plans and re-angle towards potentially having to fight a war in Europe as well. And then obviously over in the Pacific, the Japanese have decided that they had a go at taking bits of the Russian Empire in 1905. Now they want to try and expand their holdings into mainland Asia again. And this is kind of, in Japan, it's actually a bit of a two-front war because the Imperial Japanese Navy, which is its own political power, they want to expand into the Pacific, into the Central and Eastern Pacific, and they see Japan's destiny as a great maritime power. The Imperial Japanese Army, on the other hand, rather unsurprisingly, sees Japan's future as a great land power, so they want to invade China. And that's how they end up in Manchuria, and there's obviously China gets into a bit of a civil war between its own nationalists and communists, and the Russians are looking at this, and they're in a kind of two minds about it because they don't like the Japanese coming onto the mainland Asian soil because they think this is where we can go. They've already destabilized and taken out Mongolia, splitting the attention of the Chinese forces. And so from that respect, the USSR is looking at it going, well, actually, if the Japanese and the Chinese want to fight each other to the death, then we can potentially move in and hoover up as long as one side or the other doesn't win very quickly.
And so Chris, in the 1930s, you already see those themes we talked about at the start. Obviously, Italy said the birthplace of fascism, Britain losing parts of its empire, and Japanese expansion. Now, the relationship between Japan and the Soviet Union, something we've covered previously on History Undone, that's also a very important part of this period of history.
Absolutely, and as Drax says, there's an ambivalent policy by Stalin, really. The Soviets have been pushing down into Mongolia and parts of China, and in Xinjiang, for example, they're heavily involved in that Chinese province. And they actually have a little war later on anyway, in the late 1930s. But the critical power we need to consider in the Pacific, of course, is the United States.
Absolutely.
So the United States has an open China policy in terms of trade. So it's butting up against Japan all the time. It's got various concessions in the Pacific. It runs the Philippines, of course. And so it is looking towards the Pacific, and that's where most of its trading interests are starting to lie. Obviously, it's got a relationship across the Atlantic, but it's strongly isolationist at this point, especially after the First World War. It's got interests in South America as well.
And one thing we haven't mentioned, they are hit harder by the Great Crash and the Great Depression?
Well, in volume terms, that's certainly the case. But in some ways, the structural strength of America means it can impose the New Deal under Eisenhower and start to get itself back on track. But we should be in no doubt it's the Second World War that brings essentially this depression to an end. It's got nothing to do with the New Deal, really. It just keeps America going. Meanwhile, Britain and France, as we said earlier, are just trying to consolidate and hold on to their empires. I mean, the critical thing is what you've got is Japan and also Italy saying, well, we want empires too. And that's what really starts this off. We're in an imperial world, and almost everybody is exhibiting imperial tendencies, except for those empires that have collapsed. So you've got empires that are existing, you've got empires that wish they were still empires, and obviously you've got fairly aggressive countries that also want to acquire it.
In terms of a possible Second World War then, Drac, in this scenario, do the Soviet Union have desires to push west as well?
Yes, so the Soviets in the 20s had this international communism that they wanted to push. So, and that's where you see a lot of communist interventions. As you get into the 30s and Stalin takes over from Lenin, they start to focus a little bit more inward. Partly that's driven by Stalin wanting to essentially build up the Soviet Union to more of a military juggernaut rather than a ideological one. But partly it's also because you have the rise of multiple fascist powers historically in Europe, they also see some benefit in trying to either contain them by buddying up with France and Britain. And remember, in the early 30s, that's only when the United States even recognises the Soviet Union as a country. They haven't recognised them up to that point. And then when that doesn't quite work, you then got the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, and essentially historically, both Germany and the USSR know that at some point, one side or the other is coming to dominate Europe. It's just a question of who's going to do it first.
Do you need that incredible Nazi hatred of Bolshevism for that to happen?
But remember, quite a lot of the other parties on the right wing don't like communists either. But there's another issue. The Treaty of Rapallo in 1924, the Germans and the Soviets recognised they're fairly pariah. And they actually say, we're going to cooperate militarily. We're not going to tell anybody about it, but we are. And you see, essentially, German engineers, German industry, German investment going into the Soviet Union. They actually take over factories, and you see them turning out basically rip-off models of British and French tanks and aircraft. And, of course, the Luftwaffe actually gets a training base in the Soviet Union where it actually operates from. And as you see, right up until essentially Hitler comes to power, you see Germany and the Soviet Union actually cooperating in opposition to Britain and France. And so it's only really this very strident rhetoric and the fact that Hitler doesn't like the Bolsheviks at all, as he calls them, that this starts to then stop. You've got a general called von Schicht, and his whole life after the First World War is spent in actually building this essentially sort of military-industrial complex, which the Soviets and the Germans share. And without that, the Germans aren't building a Luftwaffe.
So are we potentially getting to a timeline where there might be a different Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact that holds?
Well,
working together in a war?
No, I think as I said, it's like both sides historically, they know that they're going for each other's throats sooner or later. It's just both are convinced that they're the ones who'll get the drop. And obviously, historically, with Barbarossa, it's Hitler who gets the drop on Stalin.
But I can't stress enough that the whole atmosphere changes when Hitler comes to power.
Exactly.
Before then, it's a different. Stalin, on several occasions, said he could tolerate a stable, almost democratic Germany. What he doesn't want is a fascist Germany. So that's the turning point in the 30s with the Soviets. They see it as a threat. And you see all these things downturning gradually, not totally. And everybody thinks the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact comes out of nowhere. It doesn't. You know, that is a continuation of a tradition.
And when you say stable from Stalin, does that imply as well someone that he can perhaps not control, but, you know, at least keep a handle on?
No threat. And by the way, it might enable me to sort out Poland, because I'm really not very happy about having this independent Poland here. And of course, as we said, coming from the other side as well, you've got the Germans not very happy. So you see in Soviet literature at the time, and quite a lot of the speeches, at some stage we need to sort out the Polish problem. And their thinking is Germany going to be a problem for us there? So all that is bubbling away. So there's definitely a fault line there. We've said already out in the Pacific, we've got it bubbling away quite nicely. The United States, at what point does that say it's getting too much? And you see throughout the 30s, of course, the United States imposing sanctions on Japan, not necessarily going to war at that point.
And just a quick word on Britain and France again. We've said that they're concerned about their empires. They don't particularly want to go to war, really, do they? I mean, what would be an event that might trigger them to go to war?
I think it's very different between the two. So France is absolutely economically and population-wise devastated by the First World War. They do not have any interest in any military action they can possibly avoid. And really their big remilitarisation is only triggered by the rise of fascist Germany.
Apart from the Maginot Line, of course, which comes in. Germany's always a problem for France in their minds. You know, they've actually, had a real problem with Alsace-Lorraine in the past, of course. They're still very sensitive about losing territory, so the Maginot Line is quite important. And the other problem is you've got really unstable politics in France.
Yeah, they go through governments like it's going out of fashion.
like we are at the moment.
But the British are a little more militaristic or bellicose because they are looking at things in terms, they don't want another world war, but they are determined they will defend the empire. And that's why, as I said earlier, they're looking at previously at Japan being the most likely enemy that they might have to fight. They've also, thanks to the Washington Naval Treaty, they've got a parity of force with the Americans. They're determined to keep that up. And actually, throughout most of the interwar period, they're actually slightly ahead of the American fleet in terms of numbers and modern technology. So, although they don't want war, they are much more prepared for war, and they're drawing up various plans, how to deal with the Japanese fleet, whether they need to deal with them alone, whether they can deal with them along with the Americans. And historically, obviously, then once the Abyssinia crisis kicks off, they actually have a plan to fight a war in Europe and a war in the Pacific, but they're planning on fighting a two-front war, and they obviously historically end up fighting a three-front war. But the other thing that they can see as sort of an impartial observer is they can see that whatever happens in Europe, there will be a war in the Pacific of some sort sooner or later, simply because, as Chris mentioned, you've got these sanctions that America's imposing on Japan, eventually escalates all the way up to oil sanctions. In the 1930s, you need oil to run your military, you need oil to run your country, and Japan doesn't have a native oil resource. The only place they can get it if America shuts them off is the Dutch East Indies. And as soon as America puts those oil sanctions in, it starts a timer. And the Japanese know they're on a timer of how long before we run out of oil, and count back from there to when's the last point we can meaningfully conduct military action to take the Dutch East Indies. That's their threshold. And in order to do that and hold the Dutch East Indies for any amount of time, they know they're going to have to attack America. So that war is coming, regardless of what's happening in Europe.
In a Nazi-less Germany, but if we go back to Europe, on the subject of oil then, are people looking towards the Caucasus and the Middle East?
Well, I mean, oil is one of those things that if you can actually get it peacefully and you can buy it, why go to war? That's the point. Remember, at this time, Britain's heavily into Iran. The Anglo-Persian oil company has been set up in the 20s, 26 in fact. And so everybody's reaching out and looking for oil. But as I said, if you can get it peacefully, then it's not a problem if you can secure your supplies. And I think with Germany, the key issue right now is you're heading towards 1932, 1933. Is Hitler inevitable? Well, he's not, because there's a whole load of other actors who could come in, but with a right-wing regime, and I think Drac and I have discussed this, there is the possibility for civil war. You've got this hugely militarised society. Everybody's got weapons. You've got the Stahlhelm, 500,000. You've got the SA, the SS, lots of other paramilitary groups. But what you're heading towards is the collapse of the Weimar Republic and the heavy likelihood that you're going to get what you and I would call a far-right regime in Germany, which may bring back the Kaiser, it may not, but you're going to get that anyway. So all the agendas that they bring with them basically come along as well, and it's very close to what the Nazis want.
Do you agree with that?
Yeah. It's because the thing is, as we said earlier, the German right-wing parties are far more militarised. So historically, they get what they want to a degree, or at least the Nazis do. If they don't get what they want, either potentially a left-wing coalition taking power, or even someone like von Papen going, OK, well, I'm in charge now, and I'm going to do the roundup of all my political adversaries, including other people on the right. Either of those could trigger massive street riots and full-on civil war, because the right-wing parties are far better organised for that.
And that militarisation, civil war, they would come out on top.
Yeah, and at that point, the Treaty of Versailles actually kind of hampers the Weimar Republic's ability to respond, because it's limited the size of the German military to a point where if portions of that military who do sympathise with the right-wing parties decide to defect, break open some armories, that plus the Sturmabteilung, the SS, and the Stahlhelm actually would outnumber the law enforcement and military capabilities of the Weimar Republic, at which point you get a civil war kind of similar to how you'd get a civil war later on in that decade in Spain.
I mean, yeah, it looks a bit like Spain. I mean, that's the key point. But then you move on, Fergus, and you say, well, OK, so if you've got that, what's its attitude to Italy, for example? Well, probably friendly. And we're not fascists, but we're actually very, very close to you. What happens in the Spanish Civil War? Do we intervene? Because without the German intervention, then you probably find the Republicans win. So you've got a sympathetically communist, social democrat type regime there. Stalin's going to be interested in that. In fact, he was interested, as you know, he intervened. So the whole pattern changes. My instinct is that there are two things, aren't there? One is you're getting a far-right government anyway. Yep. So most of the Nazi agenda is being put in place. But what are you doing with the Nazis at this point? So there was a suggestion at one point by von Papen that Hitler would be the vice-chancellor. Well, yeah, that'd be interesting. But you know, you can see the patterns revolving around here. You're getting a far-right government anyway. So what changes? Well, you've got to contain the Nazis. That's the key point. And that's going to be a bit of a problem because, as we said, they've got heavy military elements as well. Are they going to behave? My sense is that Hitler would have been patient, actually, and said, I'm going to see how this rolls out, see if they fall out, see if I can... He would continue to undermine everybody. But actually, foreign policy from 1933 onwards, it looks very much like the Nazi parties, I would suggest. They want the Rhineland back. They want Austria, and they want probably bits of Poland that they lost in the First World War.
Well, hold all these thoughts because that is the real history of the Nazis' rise to power and some of the causes behind the Second World War. Now let's undo all of that. This is History Undone. OK, it's time to get into what we love doing here on History Undone, ask ourselves some of those really long-term questions. Had the Nazis not risen to power? Do we still get a Second World War? And if so, how does it start? Drac, I'm going to start with you.
Yeah.
That question that I just ended on there, what sparks a Second World War if we're saying that we do still get one of sorts?
So I think the war is probably going to start a little bit later. A lot of people in the late 30s could see a world war was coming, but everyone seemed to arrive at late 41, early 42 as the date they thought this was going to happen. Obviously gets accelerated by the historical timeline. Now, I think that might actually be the case because although you're going to have a far-right government in Germany, and they are still going to be fairly militaristic, compared to the Nazi build-up of Germany's military, I think it's going to be more delayed, partly because it's almost like you are going to have a German civil war. And even if that's a brief one, that's still time that...
You've lost time.
You've lost time, and you've got to rebuild, you've got to restabilise. And then you've got to, as Chris pointed out, what do you do with the Nazis if they're not the ones in power? You might end up spending more time on essentially internal security to make sure that they don't just then rise up and topple the government, which is obviously time you're not militarising. Or you might look at external threats and try and unite the people behind an external perspective, but you're still going to have to play things very carefully because you're going to be trying to expand the German military, but in a way that doesn't mean that the Nazis can then infiltrate that military and take over, which, having just had a brief civil war, you know that they very well might. But either way, it means that German militarism, to a point where they can be a threat, is offset by a handful of years, at which point the flashpoint could be, I think, one of three things. The least likely would be a communist Spain doing something like perhaps trying to take over Portugal, as Spain keeps trying to do over hundreds of years. And that could potentially trigger multiple interventions. Fairly unlikely.
Certainly from Britain.
Yeah.
Yep.
Another possibility would be what historically kicks off the Second World War, which is an invasion of Poland,
Indeed. But
happening a year or two later, probably led by Stalin at that point. So it'd be more of a communist invasion rather than a German invasion.
Or we'll get there before the Germans do.
Exactly. That would be the main motivation. It's like he now sees himself as ahead in the race, so get in there first. Or potentially, the other thing which is quite likely, especially if we're looking at late 41, 42, is the timer for the Japanese oil reserves runs out. They hit America, the Pacific War erupts, and at that point, if you're a militaristic right-wing Germany looking to take bits out of Europe, the main two that you've got to keep an eye on, apart from the Russians, are the French and the British. The French have holdings in Indochina. The British have, as we can see on the map, extensive holdings in the sort of southwest Pacific area. They are then going to, if a war breaks out, even if they don't join the US, which they very well might, they're still going to be diverting significant military resources to secure their parts of the southwest Pacific. And suddenly the eye is off of Europe, the military resources are away from Europe. That is the prime time for Germany to strike.
You see, I think if you don't actually have war in Europe that ties up Britain and France, that means they can reinforce their colonies here. So the Japanese are going to have to think, are we going to take them on while they're strong? Because remember, when it did happen in late 1941, France, the Netherlands and Britain were almost on their knees at that point. And so they were easy to take out here. Now, I'm thinking actually that in the absence of something going on in Europe, the Japanese are not going to go for the oil here. They're going to go for the oil in Siberia, and there's quite a lot there. And the production levels are at least comparable with what the Japanese are getting from, could get from the Dutch East Indies. So my instinct is that one of the effects of this, if Britain and France aren't brought in early, is the Japanese actually say, you know what, the army lobby wins here. We'll hold off the Americans with the Navy if necessary, because the Americans are going to get interested because of their open China policy and what we're doing in Manchuria. But you know what? We'll reinforce on the mainland.
And it's something we've covered before in History Undone, an invasion of Siberia. I remember one of the questions we asked, is there anyone in sort of Soviet high command who might just say, oh, it's a tiny bit of Siberia, we'll leave it. But that's obviously that would be during the Second World War. In that scenario, that would be a completely different ballgame.
Yeah, I mean, the Japanese, since the 1905-6 conflict, have not done that well, actually, on land in Siberia. Zhukov beat them at the start of the First World War. But, of course, that doesn't happen in the same way. If the Japanese go in hard and put all their resources into that, it's a totally different situation. Now, if, as Drax says, Stalin's concerned with actually going into Poland, he's going to have to devote resources to that. Can they actually do that? He's just purged his army. He's not modernised completely at this stage. So it's a bit difficult. So if that happens, you've got a situation where Germany's going to react. That's the other thing, of course. And the last thing that Stalin wants is a coalition of capitalist countries in Europe facing him when he's dealing with something in the Far East.
And are we sure, if he does go for Poland, are we sure we get that, or do we have a more smaller, contained European war?
Well, I mean, the Soviets have previously gone after Finland, and that didn't end particularly well for them. Poland has a better military machine than Finland does. I think a lot of it is going to depend on which side of Greater Eurasia does everything kick off first, because if it kicks off in the Pacific first and the Soviet attention is drawn mostly to there, they can't afford to fight at two ends of the USSR, so they're going to have to play it very defensively in Europe. Conversely, if they don't see that coming, because let's face it, the one thing the Japanese are good at this point is surprise attacks. If they don't see it coming and they decide to get into Europe first, I think it's going to be a very big game of brinksmanship, because, as Chris pointed out, the last thing they want is the whole of Europe uniting against them, but they also don't want to lose the opportunity to get Eastern Europe before the Germans do. And if you have a right-wing but not Nazi Germany, and the Soviets are pouring into Eastern Europe, it's very easy at that point, given just how much anti-communist propaganda has been going around in the 30s, for Germany to turn around and go, oh, look, hey guys, can you drop the Versailles restrictions? Because guess what? The Red Hordes are coming and we need your help.
I mean, that is the issue.
Yeah.
I think that's the way you get what you and I would call a world war, is where Germany says, help.
Help.
They're in Poland. Look at this. This is part of the Treaty of Versailles. We've always said there's a problem. Now stand behind us. And that certainly is a scenario where you end up with that. Now, I think Stalin would back off in those circumstances.
You really think so?
Well, if he's got something
going on in the East.
So he's going to back off.
Yeah, it's going to depend a huge amount on what's happening in the Pacific. But also I think there's also kind of the sunk cost fallacy. If it's an initial Soviet offensive and Germany's immediately ringing the alarm bells and everyone's turning around saying, no, back out of Poland or else, then it's not quite nothing ventured, nothing gained, but Stalin can afford to kind of go, oh, okay, maybe I'll just keep going after Finland.
Yeah.
Or I'll come back next year.
Yeah. Or if the Red Army's already taken Warsaw and they're kind of in almost the consolidation phase by the time the Western European powers get their act together, then at that point Stalin's probably going to be going, well, look, we've sunk enough, as we're seeing in Ukraine at the moment. Yeah. We've sunk so much resource into this conflict already, we can't back out without losing a huge amount of face. At which point it then becomes the question for Stalin is do we
are Germany and Japan still allies in this scenario, or are they just fighting on their own fronts?
No. But what's interesting, at this point, you're not really ready for a war in Europe. So you say to Japan, we'd like to be allied with you now, please.
And the Americans?
The Americans say, right, the situation's changed a bit here. We're still pressing on you because of China, but if you're going against the Soviet Union, well, hey, we might be able to help you on that. But we need to talk about what's going on in China at the moment. So my instinct is, if they do go for this, you're going to see troops flooding out of Manchuria anyway to actually deal with this situation. Remember, the Soviets got huge numbers of aircrafts and tanks that they can actually bring to bear here. So they're going to need these troops to actually consolidate that. But I think you've got an interesting situation where you've got a world war where the United States basically will supply everybody.
Yeah.
And you've got Britain, France, maybe Germany and Japan containing a Soviet Union that's suddenly found itself out of control.
And when you say containing, I know, Chris, you thought Stalin might back down in that scenario. When you paint it like that, I'm probably more inclined to agree. If he doesn't, then you get, a war with all the other great powers taking on the Soviet Union. Does that lead to a breakup of the Soviet Union?
No, I think you'll find that the Russians will push everything west, everything they've got, and say, look, we'll deal with this later, because these are vast expanses here that you can soak up the Japanese
And
army.
as far as the United States is concerned, this is almost perfect for them, because the US still has a very strong isolationist movement in the 30s. They don't want to get involved in foreign conflicts, but they have foreign policy aims. So if they're faced with a situation of, well, Britain and France, the two big empires that they have to worry about on a global stage, are potentially going to exhaust themselves in yet another European land war, and the Japanese are going to shift their attention from China to Russia and not expand out into the Pacific, and the United States is ideologically opposed to communism anyway, they're looking at it going, well, our three biggest problems are going to go and hit our fourth biggest problem over the head repeatedly. This is great. We'll sell them weapons at a massive markup and sit back and watch the fireworks, because at the end of the day, they're hoping that a fight with the USSR will grind everybody down to the point that the US default has dominance of the world.
So we don't think the US would be militarily involved at all? Just supply?
Not unless somebody is stupid enough to attack them. Obviously, the Japanese have enough internal divisions of their own, but I think the default state of the US would be to not get involved unless and until somebody did something that was basically a provocation they couldn't ignore.
You look not so sure?
No, I agree with that. I was just reflecting that, we could end up with a situation where the Soviet Union's got to the Channel Coast and you're in the same situation we were with Dunkirk, so it's quite an interesting scenario. But at what point do you tripwire France and Britain, who don't want to get involved in a war?
No.
That's the key point. Is it when Germany says, look, they're on our borders, we need help now, and all the instincts were to say, well, Germany was the problem just now. Soviet Union wasn't. And so I just wonder how quickly, Drac, Britain and France can react in Europe to this. I just don't think they've got an offensive capability.
The French aren't going to want to send troops over their own border.
And they didn't to the Rhineland, of course.
The British Expeditionary Forces, on the scale of Germany and potentially Italy versus the Soviet Union, the British Expeditionary Force is a very small number of people. I think if they are going to get involved at all, it's probably going to be a little bit like when they had the intervention in 1919. So it's going to be probably primarily naval forces trying to cut off trade.
Black Sea, Baltic.
Black Sea. There's a bit of trade going across the north, secure the Baltic, to secure Sweden, and probably back up the Finns. So a little bit like how at the beginning of the Second World War, you have the Americans kind of tacitly supporting Britain but not actively involved. You'd probably have Britain and possibly France sending lots of weapons and aircraft to Finland, to Germany, to reinforce Sweden.
I think you're right. I mean, to this day, they're totally neurotic, the Russians, about the Black Sea and the Baltic.
Yeah.
So these are the pressure points on the majority of their population to the west of the Urals here.
This scenario that we're painting sounds pretty dire for Britain and France.
I mean,
especially, how do they get out of this?
It's a very, unlike the Second World War, which eventually coalesces into like Allies versus Axis, this is a very bitty war because the US is notionally on their side, but not really. They want them to achieve their aims, but at extreme cost. And everyone is kind of, Japan and Britain have very different strategic aims. It's just at this point they both hate the USSR. So it's very much an enemy of my enemy rather than actual allies.
So there's another issue as well, of course. If you're at war with the Soviet Union, you've got a lot of imperial troops here in India, Australia, New Zealand.
Yep.
Of course, traditionally, they've come and helped in Europe. Well, you could be fighting with the Japanese to actually put pressure on this. Meanwhile, the Russians are trying to break out. As we said, the Americans are just trading with everybody and saying, send us your gold, try and survive.
Yeah, I think it's going to be almost like an eastward relocated version of the Napoleonic Wars, where Britain's main contribution is going to be, hey, we'll supply you with weapons, we'll supply you with money, and we'll lock down international trade against our target. But we're not really putting boots on the ground. Maybe the Russian Navy isn't really much of anything at that point, but maybe the RAF will have some involvement. But that's probably about it, and it'll be mostly down to the European armies, particularly Germany and Italy, and the Japanese, to actually do the on-the-ground fighting. But then, the way out for Britain is very difficult because if you get success, you can potentially force the Russians to terms eventually if you push them back far enough. But if just the German army isn't enough and the Russians roll westwards, then you have a lot of problems.
I mean, there is a but. There's a but. And that is, at what point does this happen? Because we're all thinking 38, there's been a purge, all the generals have got this, that, and the other. Does it happen before Ukraine is starved into submission and things like that? So how good do we think the Soviets are at this stage?
And Drax said earlier it might not start till 41, 42 though as well.
But they will have modernised by then. They'd have reordered. And the Western areas are very heavily populated by the Soviet army. We know that from Barbarossa. So I think the momentum and mass that driving forward here is going to be very difficult to deal with, particularly in a Germany that has been demilitarised to the extent it has been. I mean, again, we need to bring up the fact that Spain may be on the same side as the Soviet Union at this stage. Well, that presents a bit of a problem for France, doesn't it? And for Italy as well. So I think galvanising the resources here is going to be quite a difficult problem, and actually getting on the ground and confronting that mass. I'm just thinking that we're in danger of saying here it's just as well as the Nazi Party came to power. If you're going down this scenario,
we'll leave that
the one thing
behind.
that stops that, the thing that stops that is the Nazi Party. The key thing you're not getting, of course, is you're not getting Barbarossa in this scenario. You're not getting the Holocaust.
No.
Because there was no plan at all in these other right-wing parties to eliminate the Jewish race.
Which is the difference between the sort of more far-right ideology and the Nazi ideology.
I mean, there's a lot of other stuff as well tucked in there about racial theory, all the religious theory and all the other things. But you're not talking about an extreme racial ideology that results in extermination of both Slavs and Jewish people. That's the key point.
I think World War II shifts from basically being, as we see it now, democracy versus fascism, essentially. It probably becomes a capitalism versus communism war. And, I mean, to be fair, at the end of the day, long-term, probably the capitalists are going to win that because they've got the industry. But it's not going to be a really defined war where specific campaigns leading to specific objectives. It's going to be a big flare-up, and it's probably going to gradually grind down into smaller theatres, bit by bit, which gradually.
But how do you keep the United States engaged in this if they're not involved in conflict? So are they still trading with the Soviet Union, for example, in these circumstances?
Probably be blockaded, so I suspect not.
You'd think we'd be able to do that. But the United States as a neutral in all of this changes the whole geometry of a world war, because if you haven't got America, you haven't got a world war.
I just want to pull out slightly and apologise to any other international viewers for being too British focused. Just allow me this indulgence. I think I said to Chris before, if you get a different Second World War, after the war, obviously you see some countries industrialise and boom. In Britain, we have a period of managed decline. Obviously, we're so much in debt to the Americans. I suggested to Chris beforehand, maybe you don't get that. It sounds like in our scenario, that's potentially even much, much worse.
Yeah.
How does Britain sort of emerge during the 20th century?
Absolutely. You get a situation where you are recovering, you are in hock to the United States. One thing that occurs to me, of course, is you don't hear of a guy called Churchill ever again. Because his whole basis in the 1930s, of course, is actually being anti-Nazi. He's not needed necessarily in 1940 under this scenario. And what happens then? But you're right, Fergus, France and Britain are going to be really stretched. But what if they say, another counterfactual to Germany, you're on your own, mate?
I mean, the other thing is, bear in mind, you also don't get the U-boat campaign.
Of course.
So although Britain's spending huge amounts of money on a war, it's also not having its trade ripped apart. And we know historically in the post-World War II environment, huge amounts of money were diverted to rebuilding the British merchant marine to try and bring trade back, to try and reinvigorate the British economy.
In fact, there's a really good point, because in all of this, Britain's just carrying on, isn't it? As if nothing else has happened.
Yeah.
It's obviously excluding this. You're right, they could be blockading, but everywhere else, you're not going to see the Russian fleet anywhere,
like I said earlier, it's like the Napoleonic Wars redux, where Britain is bringing in all the world's trade and sending all that money to the front without huge amounts of actual military involvement itself. Except for possibly, I think the single thing you might see would be a long-range strategic bombing campaign, because that would be a hugely outsized effect on Soviet industry, because Britain's one of the few places in Europe that actually has heavy bombers at that point. So they could potentially...
And you can buy a lot more as well. I mean, I think the key point here, Fergus, is we've got to remember that most of what I would call Russian population is west of the Urals.
Yeah.
So, as Drax says, it can be struck, and we've talked about the Baltic and the Black Sea. And what I think you will see here is the very rapid development of these long-range bombers and other vehicles, maybe even missiles, actually. Missile technology is starting to develop there. And, of course, the Germans are thinking about this even in the late 30s. So you could get to a situation where you are, rather like Ukraine today, selecting St. Petersburg, Moscow, Volgograd, that became Stalingrad, of course. You could actually have that scenario where you're actually hitting from distance.
We are going to have to bring things to a close, but I think that's sort of one of the most far-reaching counterfactuals we've covered on this channel, so thank you both for being with us. I think we're saying that had the Nazis not come to power, we would still get a Second World War, but what would it look like? I mean, it depends, and almost certainly very different. You probably get the Soviet Union engaging with the Japanese in the east, but on the Western front, do you get most of Europe combining to do a one-on-one fight with the Soviet Union, almost a communism versus capitalist war? The United States, now they would be supplying the capitalists, they would almost certainly stay out of it militarily. And at the end of the day, what happens to Britain and France and their empires of the 20th century? We dread to think about that as three men standing in a studio in London. I'm afraid that is all we've got time for today. My thanks to Rear Admiral Dr. Chris Parry and Kinefeld for joining me. We'll be back and doing more history very soon. Remember to like this video and subscribe to our channel on YouTube. And you can also listen and follow the show as a podcast. Just search for History Undone in your podcast apps. We'll see you next time. Goodbye.